Good evening. I want to welcome all of you here. Can we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now I'd just like to go around the room so that we can all introduce ourselves. I'm Linda Lukoski. I'm chair of the school committee.
Caitlin Hunter, Vice Chair of the Triton School Committee.
Narissa Wallen, Triton School Committee.
Paul Goldner, Triton School Committee.
Alicia Greco, Chair of the Newbury Select Board.
Jeff Walker, Newbury Select Board.
Joe Perry, Raleigh, Vice Chairman of the Select Board.
Paul Mayette, Secretary of the School Committee.
Dawn Shand, State Representative for the 1st Essex, including Salisbury.
Hi, I'm State Senator Bruce Tarr, the Minority Leader.
It's on.
Okay.
Chuck DeKeesian, Salisbury Selectman, representing the finest town in Senator Tarr's district.
Mike Colburn, Salisbury Selectman.
Ronnie Ray Parrott, Salisbury Select Board.
Phil DeCollegiero with Auditor DeSaglio's office.
Kyle Warren, Director of Finance and Operations with Triton.
And Brian Forget, the Superintendent of Schools. Can we have you three reintroduce yourselves? Because I don't think your mics were on. So if it wasn't green, then everyone at home is wondering who you are. Maybe not.
Again, I am Dawn Shand. I am the State Representative, and my district covers Salisbury.
Okay. Hi, I'm State Senator Bruce Tarr, the Minority Leader of the Massachusetts State Senate and Special Assistant to Superintendent Brian Forget.
Kristen Kasner, representing the 2nd Essex District in Triton, Newbury and Raleigh.
Okay, we have notes here from the last meeting for DCC, so you guys all have them. And then I'm going to turn this over to Brian.
All right, well, welcome everyone. So tonight, the goal is a discussion, right? We are seated in a square so that we can have a discussion. Unfortunately, one side had to have their backs to the screen, so you all have copies of the slides. But I have a PowerPoint to kind of guide our discussion, but the purpose is not for Brian to do a show and tell or a Sage on the Stage act. This is about, I want to start the discussion, but anyone around the table, school committee members, state representatives, town representatives, let's make this a dialogue, because this, the purpose of tonight, as I have here, is first of all for us to share with you kind of the reality of what's going on here in the district, specifically in how that relates to efforts at the state level, and then we would love to hear from you. So, so I'll kick it off, unless anyone else wants to kick it off. Hearing nothing. Okay, so I'm going to, again, share this information and focus or frame it in two areas. One, urgent needs, things that we're looking for your help with immediately in this budget cycle, and then some long-term needs that I don't believe any of us think realistically could be resolved this year, but that are items that we have talked about. Those who've been around a while, this will sound all too familiar, but these are things that we really want to make sure that we have provided to you and have on your radar. I know not next, is it next Friday? The North Shore Superintendent's Roundtable is having a legislative meeting, and you'll hear a lot of those same themes again, that this is the things, the challenges we're facing are certainly not unique to Triton. So, so the first one is school meals. This I understand in the supplemental budget. I know I saw a State House News flash, Senate and House today jointly reworked the supplemental budget, and school meals are continued through the end of this year. That's wonderful. And my understanding is House 1 does include universal meals next year. We just want to reiterate how important that is. I know there's certainly folks who would say those who can afford to pay the meal or for the meal should be paying for the meal. Those who can't afford to pay for the meal should be provided at no cost. I would argue that the implementation of universal meals, and it's here at Triton and it's everywhere else at all the other schools, has leveled the playing field in a way that we never would have anticipated. Students have access to breakfast and lunch at school without any barriers whatsoever. And it changes the way decisions are made, actions are taken, and even the culture in the lunchroom has changed. So on top of that, it's allowed for a greater offering. Our food service director, Sarah Littman, has been, she was meeting with Senator Markey. I mean, she's been in Washington, all over the place with Project Bread and advocating for this. And it really is a game changer, and I think it oftentimes gets simplified. But beyond the value of having meals for all kids without questions, it actually generates revenue, so we're back to being a self-supporting program. If you talk to any food service director or superintendent or business manager across the state, there were times when cost of food and cost of labor and cost of utilities was lower, and the program supported itself. Now, the program doesn't even cover the cost of the labor and supplies. So every year, we're backfilling the food services budget with general fund money that's coming from some other program. So for the first time, we're in a situation where the program is generating enough revenue to offset all of the costs, and we're in a situation where we can charge more, what's the term, the kind of inclusive costs, I forget the term there is, direct costs, thank you, or indirect costs of that program directly to the food services program, which it doesn't free up money that we're assuming. It frees up money that as we go through, it seems like prior to the last few years, every year as we go through the budget, we were figuring out how to cover this $50,000, $100,000, sometimes even more dollar gap that emerged in the program. So more students are accessing meals. It's given more revenue and funding to be able to be more creative. I believe there's going to be an event, I'm not supposed to announce it, but later, sometime in May, where USDA and all of our local reps, state reps will obviously be invited as well. And they chose Triton as the site to come in and look at how the program is running. So we will advocate strongly that, and we have, but Sarah Littman surely has, as well as the committee, on behalf of Universal Meals. So it sounds like it's resolved for the balance of this year. Thank you. But we would certainly look to you to say, make sure that's a priority in next year's budget as well. So any questions about that before we move on, or anyone else want to add input? Kyle, or? Yeah.
I just want to speak to the number of people from Salisbury who have reached out to my office specifically about school meals. We do keep careful track of who asks for these initiatives, and it has been the single most asked for program that I've seen. So I just want to note how much I appreciate all of that advocacy.
Great.
And I just think we have to look beyond even next year to try and get this in the budget as a permanent fixture so that it's free lunch always.
I just had a comment. I have heard, as obviously it's advocates to continue the program, but also benefits of the program are allowing schools to kind of plan ahead a little bit more, forecast out. And with that, some of us were at the farm breakfast this morning with a lot of local agriculture. And I've also heard from a lot of my constituents of how can we work with schools and school systems, especially with this type of program, to do a better job of introducing local foods and different types of foods into the school system, or not different types, coming in, and then at the other end, really kind of managing what's also whether it's a composting program or other types of programs of food that might be able to go out. So that's just something I wanted to, I'm not interested in talking necessarily about tonight, but just in general, kind of that ecosystem of food and how this program and continuing this program can help all of us do a better job of connecting the other resources if we can plan out a little bit more. So I'm just wanted to make that
Absolutely.
comment.
And a couple of weeks ago, I had a grass-fed burger in a school cafeteria. So those are the programs that Sarah has put into place, and farm to table and working with local produce and farms. And so that takes money, and the universal meals makes that a possibility.
So I just point out a couple of things. Number one, the good news is that the supplemental budget, including the funding for the remainder of the fiscal year, is on its way to the governor's desk. It was approved this afternoon in the Senate, and an emergency preamble was added. So we would expect we'll get fairly quick action on that, which is good. Number two, even though it's in House 1, it does still need to be included in the budgets by the House and the Senate. So it isn't a given, but it does have a lot of support. Number three, a piece of legislation has been filed for this session by Senator DiDomenico and others to be able to make the program permanent, and it is enjoying a lot of co-sponsorship at this point. There is still time for co-sponsorship, but is enjoying a lot of co-sponsorship, and I spoke to him today about how we can move the bill forward in an expeditious way so that we can make this a permanent part of the landscape. I would hope, Brian, that maybe you could delve into a little bit more of the comment that you had made about the revenue-generating aspect of it so that I can understand that better, and maybe my colleagues as well. And then just a last comment is, along with what Representative Kastner said, I would hope that we could look at how we can reduce food waste over time, too, because it's a major factor for the Commonwealth in terms of our environmental programs, and schools obviously are a large source of that. So, but if you could just touch for a moment on the revenue-generating component of it, that would be helpful.
Absolutely, and I'll ask Kyle to jump in if you can add any more detail. So the key point is every meal that's served is reimbursable versus some students qualifying for that full reimbursement, others at a reduced level, and then a very small reimbursement for those who are paying for it. So it's the balance of the cost that it actually, the amount that it actually costs to produce a meal with the amount that we're getting in. So every meal, and this gets to the food waste discussion, every meal to be reimbursable, this is going to be my test, has to have the main meal, the vegetable, the drink, and one other thing. That's my meal, but apparently that's not required. Should be, I like your thinking. So it has to be a fully reimbursable meal. Kids don't always love their green beans, and so that ends up right in the trash. So even if, a student, if they want a slice of pizza, they have to get the full meal to have it be reimbursable, even if they're going to throw everything right in the trash. So we've been having some discussions about composting. In more advanced recycling, it can get challenging because contamination is a problem. And was it Black Earth was the company we were talking with in partnership with Triton Education Foundation. But nothing can be contaminated. So it's only viable compost if it's managed well. A cafeteria of 400 students just throwing things in requires some supervision, so we're working through those logistics. But I don't know if that answered the question about, I don't know if there's any of the data points that you would want to add, Kyle, about the
Just
money.
to reiterate, the operational approach with it is historically, like Brian was mentioning, the food service operations have always been at a loss because of the lack of revenue that we've generated. And so structurally, we've had to subsidize those operations through the general operating budget. The biggest chunk of that has been health insurance and benefit costs for our food service staff. We're now at a point where we're generating sufficient enough federal reimbursements, federal and state reimbursements, where we can cover all of our costs associated with that program, which would then alleviate the structural subsidy that the general fund has been providing. That makes sense.
So I appreciate the explanation, and I would suggest as you're having the conversation about reducing food waste, we'd love to continue to talk to you about how we might support that as state government, because obviously that's not something that's normally in your budget, and we'd love to talk about how we can help you whether that be through regulatory changes or whether that be financial support or whatnot, because it would actually kill two birds with one stone. And I think it would be a fruitful place for us to look. So I know we'd love to continue to talk to you about that. So.
We would love to, we have lots of thoughts. And that would involve Sarah. I know DiDomenico, she was at that signing, so she has made a connection with him. And so certainly there's a lot more knowledge in that realm with Sarah, but certainly we would love to continue that discussion.
And we'd be happy to continue to discuss dessert too. So.
Love your thinking. Shut my mic off. So moving on, the 14% OSD, as everyone keeps calling it. So OSD is Operational Services Division. It's a state agency that sets the rates for approved out-of-district private special education schools. This year, the rate was through a lot of, I mean, there's a calculation there. It was not some arbitrary number, but due to the costs and due to impacts that they endured and incurred over the pandemic, there was an argument made, and it was approved that they could increase their rates up to 14%. To our knowledge, there is no private outside or a private 766 school that did not take advantage of that 14%. It is valid. Their argument is they remained open throughout the pandemic. They remained a viable service because they had no choice to. So they've incurred insignificant new costs. But to layer on a 14% increase, which for us is over $250,000, this late in the process is a factor that is a challenge to our budget. So for us this year in our budget, we had over $900,000 new increase in costs in our out-of-district placements. None of that is included in the budget because we had reserves in our circuit breaker account to be able to, we're going to drain that down and then hopefully have a plan to work that back. But if we hadn't had that plan, we would have had another $900,000 on the already, as we all know, very large assessment that's being borne by our member towns. So that 14%, again, represents a little over $250,000 for us. So again, the history is we are members of collaboratives. So I sit on the CREST Collaborative Board and the North Shore Consortium Collaborative Board. We, as the superintendents and our school committee members, depending on the board, set the rates. So we get to have the discussion and say, okay, we're going to incur some debt. We don't want rates to go up more than 3%, 4%. And they're mostly in the 3 to 5% increase this year for the two collaboratives. But for OSD, we had no insight and no control over that decision, and we're just layered. I hate to say that we're lucky at a $250,000 increase. As I talk with my counterparts on the North Shore, there are districts that are incurring a $600,000, $700,000 increase in their out-of-district costs for those private placements. So again, this is just the private schools. We have roughly 34 students, I think, placed out, in their split pretty evenly between private placements and consortium. So a consortium, it depends on the program that's needed, right? Beverly School for the Deaf is a very unique program. It is the place to be for those who are hearing impaired. So the consortium doesn't have a program that matches that. So the consortiums have incredible programs. We've built incredible programs in district, right? That's the primary goal. Ronnie's nodding, right? We don't want to send them out of district. At the end of the day, we've built autism spectrum programs and therapeutic programs, in all of those work for the majority of students. But there is a handful of students whose needs are so severe that we can't meet them within their home school. Ideally, kids are learning in their community, in their school with their peers. But the reality is we're not set up to meet the needs of every student. So when that happens, we place them out. We place them at a consortium, North Shore Consortium or CREST. We control the rates as superintendents and committees, or they end up in a more specialized private school. That's what's being impacted by the 14%. I think it's 16 or 17 students that impact. So we will get that reimbursement. Obviously, no circuit breaker. We'll get reimbursement on that. Not all of it, but we'll get reimbursement on that in fiscal '25. So the request is mitigate this for us in the fiscal '24 budget so that we don't have this $250,000 delta that we already have to figure out in other areas. So, Ronnie, please. Yeah.
And if I can just add that because of that increase, we at the consortium are seeing a huge influx of referrals because nobody wants to send them to the private school, and they're not appropriate referrals for us, and we are busting at the seam right now. So the consortiums, I mean, many, if not most of the consortiums right now are full, that we just can't take any more students, which means when we say no to you all, then you have no choice but to go to the more expensive costs. So we're seeing more very sick kids with a lot of trauma because of COVID, and it's not going to get any better, so.
And so to confirm, Ronnalee is here as a selectman from the town of Salisbury, who also works at the consortium, not as a consortium representative. So, just make sure you think we invited them to the table. So good point. And again, if anyone else wants to jump in. So the language in the supplemental that was approved today, I didn't see language about this. It was in the governor's supplemental. It was not in what I read, 49 pages. It was definitely a skim in the last 45 minutes. But I couldn't find a reference to this, so that's certainly a question. So I think that, ultimately what we're looking for is the way the governor proposed it, it would have, you have to hit a 10% threshold increase before it kicks in, which, what if you're 9.75, you get no relief? So for us, as the superintendents, we've done a lot of work around this. It's just, we assume we're going to have a 2% increase every year for those private schools. So fund the 12% differential between what we would have assumed and what's actually going to happen. We'd take 10, right, if it's a negotiation, but 12 is a good number. So I don't know if any of you can speak to that, because there's been action since I created this PowerPoint an hour ago.
Sorry, he needs the photo opportunity.
So it is true that in the supplemental budget that was approved today, there are no additional dollars for this. In the House 1 document that Governor Healy filed, there is a 14% increase for the circuit breaker. And there are a couple of components to that. One is to try to respond. There's about $15 million to respond to the increase that was handed down by OSD. There's also money included in that 14% increase for something that I tout every chance I get, and this is driven by the North Shore School superintendents, is the fourth year of the phase-in of transportation costs being included in the circuit breaker. So good news there as well in terms of the governor's budget, and we're very appreciative of that. And I have to say, for those that weren't part of those discussions, that would not have happened without the North Shore Superintendent's Roundtable. And so it was a great partnership, and it was one of the great victories that we had in the Student Opportunity Act, was to get that cost of transportation included, because as many people who are familiar with this know, the cost of transportation sometimes is equal to or more than the cost of instruction or the cost of tuition. So we had a victory there. With regard to this, the governor did something very interesting that some of us are still trying to figure out. So she filed, and I would point out, she filed the original SUP that we passed today, but she recently filed another SUP, the price tag of which could be as much as $1 billion. My estimate is lower, but I've heard estimates higher than that. And in that supplemental budget, she attempts to supplement spending for fiscal year 24 that we have not yet approved. So it's a bit of a mystery, because we don't know that there'll be a deficiency yet to supplement, because we haven't passed the budget. So we're looking at this. I met with the Committee on Ways and Means today, and we're all kind of scratching our heads, talked with the Senate President about it yesterday. But I think the main point is we understand. And I talked to the Chair of Ways and Means today on the Senate side, and my colleagues are having their budget meetings right now as we speak. And I know this is going to be an issue for all of the representatives as well, to see what we can do by way of a one-time remediation of this to be able to help address that gap, Brian, that you mentioned. But I think it's also important to recognize that that 14% increase doesn't go away after 1 year. So ultimately, we've got to look at making the circuit breaker more sustainable in addition to addressing that gap. Now, the governor's budget proposal in some ways does that. because it would increase by 14% the amount of money going into the circuit breaker. So it may self-correct over time. But I think there's two moving pieces here. One is the gap that you identified, and the second is the lasting effect of baking into everyone's budgets that 14%. And that's assuming that we don't have another increase by OSD. And I would say that there are a number of us that are still talking with OSD, trying to understand exactly what happened. And you know, you mentioned that it's formulaic, and to some degree it is, but we would like to understand better how the formula got applied in the way that it did, because I think many, many people were surprised by that 14%.
I'll just add, I too have been asking these questions, like how did this 14% come across? One thing that we have heard is that teachers in these special schools make $30,000 less than an average Massachusetts public school teacher. So I think there was some sense that we had to do something critical to mitigate that. And on the House side, I do think I'm hearing more and more conversations about better funding for the circuit breaker.
Yeah, when we were putting our budget together, at least the group of, there's 22 freshmen in a group of us. It's, you know, the priorities for the district, which obviously included this education, and then statewide priorities. And so many of us, I guess, kept repeating this 14% circuit breaker. So I know, just to echo everything said here, that we're all talking about it. The question I have quickly is, you mentioned that for Triton it's 250,000 increase, some is 600,000. Is most of that driven by just numbers of students that are going, like you have 34, so other districts have more students?
The number of students and the placement. Okay. So at a later slide, I'll get to, we have one student who moved into the district and it will be 539,000. So obviously a very specialized placement. So it's, there are neighboring districts who have incurred just a significant number of those types of cases where the need is so great, there isn't an alternative.
Right.
So.
Okay, thank you.
And
all right.
I just want to add one thing.
Certainly.
I do think there is also talk about creating a pothole fund for districts where you have that case, where you do need extraordinary relief. So that is another conversation that we are having.
Yeah. In extraordinary relief, right, that exists, so that anything over 125%, I think the North Shore superintendents and a lot of others would argue that 25% differential, if your total spend is $2 million or $2.5 million, to get that $500,000 increase before you even can start to get reimbursement is too high. So love the idea of the pothole or the extraordinary relief. As you've all said, the thresholds need to change.
And that's why it's a good time for us to be having this conversation, because ultimately we will define the pothole program that goes to the governor's desk, and hopefully we can get it in a position that works for everybody. And I know most people in here are probably familiar. We've done pothole accounts for lots of different things in the past. It used to be a regular component of the budget, and we need to define the criteria by which that will be available. And usually pothole accounts were created to address unique circumstances faced by school districts. I think what's interesting about this issue is this 14% increase affects every school district. And so trying to structure what those eligibility criteria look like is going to be an important task. But I agree with Representative Shand. I think if there was one likely vehicle to be able to address this one-year gap, it probably would be a pothole account. And, you know, we're trying to get our hands around the cost so that we can properly structure that pothole account. And that's not as easy as it sounds. So we're going to maybe need to work with you and MASS to be able to understand as best we can the total impact, total dollar impact of that 14% across the board, so that we can figure out how to use the pothole account if that's the vehicle we use.
Thank you. We are vehicle agnostic. It's the dollars we care about.
We understand the mercenary nature of
Brian, is there actually a definition of where that tuition hike goes, or is it spread across the whole program?
So OSD sets an amount that tuitions can increase. So regardless of the program, whether it's hearing impaired or mental, whatever the capacity is, all of those programs have the ability to increase, again, private, have the ability to increase their rates by up to 14%. MAPS, which is the Mass Association of Private Special Ed Schools, basically said, you need the money, take the money, and so it was pretty universal that all of those programs increased their rate. So it's not the same dollar value, right? One might have gone from, simple math, 100,000 to 114,000. Another might have gone from 50 to 57.
Jeff, I think in shorthand, the best way to think of it is tuition was allowed to increase by 14%. So, and there's a lot of components that go into tuition that OSD looks at, but ultimately that was the bottom line.
And I was just wondering, like in other things that we deal with statewide and nationally, of course, I mean, does the cost of care increase and increase and increase with more rules and regulations? And so it's something that's not going to stop anytime soon.
So I think it's important not to think of this in a vacuum, right? OSD doesn't just set rates for outplaced special education students. They set rates for a whole number of things. And the idea behind that is when state dollars are going to go into something, then the state wants to have some control over what the rate is. So it's a regulated kind of a situation. And that's the give and take that goes on here. I know OSD is under no illusion that when they set a higher rate that we're going to be putting more state money into it somehow, some way. But the idea is not to just have this unbridled situation where a Chapter 766 private school can name its price. So there's got to be some control. And to be fair, there were a number of years, either legislatively or regulatorily, OSD didn't give any tuition increase. And so, you know, there's part of the thinking here is maybe the 14% is a way to maybe compensate for that as well.
Okay, moving along. So minimum Chapter 70 on an urgent nature. So our, noting here, our towns are dealing with all the same inflation, labor shortages, insurance increases, utility increases. We are a minimum aid district, along with many across the Commonwealth. I don't know the current percentage. How many, Narissa? You don't know? Don't know. Wow. Sorry for calling you out. She always knows.
That every year. It magically comes.
So we have 2,224 students as our foundation enrollment at $30 per pupil. We're getting $66,720 new dollars in Chapter 70. That's 2.97% of our total increase in operating expenditures of $2.2-ish million. That is the gap that is continuing to exacerbate a problem. It is not in solving a problem. So for us, as far as, we'll talk about this kind of long-term solution for Chapter 70, but for us, we've had this discussion year over year, right? $100 is at a minimum per pupil. That takes it to $220,000 new dollars to Triton. We're sitting with a situation this year where we have the discussions around this table without all of our state reps, but with our town officials. And it seems like every year, one town picks up the lion's share of the budget. It has to do with enrollment swings. It's the nature of being in a region. The state formula matters. In most cities and towns that are spending so far above their minimum, the minimum local contribution means absolutely nothing to them. They're fine. They're meeting that. They're spending what they want to on education. For us, enrollment fluctuations and minimum local contribution fluctuations, which is a component of the formula, wreaks havoc on our budget. So this year, we have an increase of an assessment of about $1.95 million to our member towns. Again, that's without $911,000 of special education costs that we're carrying in circuit breaker. Rowley's student enrollment percentage is 32% roughly of the district. Their portion is $992,000 of that increase. They're paying almost half of that total increase because of a shift in enrollment They picked up 35 students where Newbury went down 10 and Raleigh went down 4, as well as their minimum local contribution shifted because of growth assumptions. So everyone's minimum local, right, everyone's budget and factors shifted with the SOA implementation. But there are structural issues in the Student Opportunity Act that need to be addressed, later slide. But in the interim, it's that short-term need of providing more relief to our towns. We've historically, I don't want to speak on behalf of the committee, but after we've approved a budget, especially when it keeps everything intact and doesn't add, but it certainly keeps everything we have in place, that if we get more state aid, that allows us to go back to the towns and say, we got our budget, we'll readjust your assessment. That's a committee decision, but that's been the historical approach. So that is meaningful and helpful and very much needed in the short term. So does anyone else want to add? People, I knew it.
No, I was just going to say, I just want to call out those two numbers. It's $195 million total assessment increase to our towns. But go back, Brian, one slide.
Just 1.95, not 195.
1.95, sorry.
We would request 195
I'm looking at numbers.
I think Joe said yes. Mute your mic, Joe, mute your mic.
And our Chapter 70 increase is $66,720.
That's stark.
And again, we'll talk about some more comparisons with our area when we get to the long-term discussion of Student Opportunity Act. So the short term, the formula is not working for Triton, and many districts like it, towns, cities like it. The minimum aid is something that allows us to actually see some revenue.
So I would just say this is a conversation we have pretty much every budget year, and last year we actually had some success in bumping that number. And in fact, through a team effort, we're actually able to double it to $60 per pupil. And I am confident that we will all work together again to see if we can bump that number. I usually file amendments to the budget at a number of different levels, and $100 per pupil is always there. But, I think it's fair to say, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I think it's fair to say that we'll work to bump that number up. And I will say, I appreciate that being in this slide deck so that it is something that's achievable to bump that number. Chapter 70 changes are a much different thing, and I'm glad you don't have that as an urgent request, because then I would have the same reaction Joe just did to the $195 million. But this is, I would suggest this is a good target for us to try to work on, particularly given the number of school districts in our region that receive that minimum per pupil aid. And so it's a good thing for us to build a coalition around and to try to move that number. And last year we did. So I just appreciate the target.
Great. Thank you. So I'll keep moving. I went backwards. MSBA. So we had a lot of discussion over the last few years about the campus you are currently sitting in. We actually completed a comprehensive facilities assessment, which is more than we need to do, but we got that proposal, and it proposed $62 million worth of repairs just to bring things back to working condition what exists. The discussion with our member towns was, well, we don't want to just replace what we have. It's not working. So let's move forward with a partnership with the state. Hopefully the state kicks in, chooses us, and reimburses half the costs, and for the same amount of money, we could get a much more updated building. So that was years of discussion with our member select boards. We submitted to the MSBA last year. We found out in December that we were not selected. So that was certainly not the news we wanted to hear, but I did just this week resubmit that statement of interest. So in the short term, this is going to be urgent, and this is going to kick us right into long term. The urgent advocacy is as we get closer to that decision point in December. I don't know, you probably all have done this. I know, Senator Tar, you've done this a few times. I don't know where in that process makes the most sense for you to lay your support for the projects, but the deadline is April 14th, but we would certainly love your support that the MSBA choose our program, our project.
So we just had a quick conversation among us. And it is, don't mind us, just talk. You know, I think it would be a good thing for us to send a joint letter to MSBA. If you would be kind enough to share the statement of interest, Brian, with us, work to put that together.
Absolutely.
And then we can think about how we can weigh in addition to that in the process. But I think it would be a good thing for us to get in the game right now. So
Great.
we'd be happy to work with you on that. And any language suggestions that you might have, we'd be
For the MSBA?
too. Yeah.
Well, that's a good idea. So on the next slide, we're going to go back one slide.
Senator Tarr, I'm going to ask you to make sure I got the number right, but somewhere in here, in House 1, the governor has recommended we put $1.4 billion into the MSBA in 2024.
That sounds right. It was either I think it was 1.3 or 1.4. And just as everyone may know, that's a transfer that results from capital gains and sales tax more than capital gains. So the anticipated increase in the sales tax is going to allow that transfer into MSBA. As you know, it gets 1 penny of sales tax collected. The other penny goes to MBTA. We don't even want to talk about that tonight, unless you want more interesting reactions. But yes, that is accurate. So we anticipate putting a healthy contribution into MSBA. But as you know, the way that MSBA works, every statement of interest competes with every other statement of interest across the Commonwealth. And so, you know, we need to put our finger on that scale, and we'd be happy to do it sooner than later.
Great. So the next slide, there's the funding of it, right? That's the penny of every dollar, so it's 1% of the sales tax. There's also a statutory cap for new projects every year of $800 million. That's where we would like to argue and say that needs to be significantly adjusted. So this was in the Student Opportunity Act. The MSBA was charged with doing their own self-study and report. The link is there. You have a copy. They did a great job. You know, they were very honest. Areas they can improve, areas where they're doing well. Ultimately, it comes down to a matter of they have an incredible structure. Not to talk ill of the previous program when it was through the Department of Ed, but the Department of Ed was not set up to run a school's reimbursement building program. The Treasury Department is, right? So it is a well-tuned, finely oiled machine. I think I said that backwards. So the program works. It's about the number of dollars going into it. So the MSBA, when they approve a project, the assumption is that building has a 50-year life. That with that routine and proper upkeep, that building should last 50 years. That doesn't always work. Case in point. So the new program, this was not built under the current MSBA or renovated under the current MSBA. So we would argue it's that statutory cap of $800,000. You need the dollars, the $1.4 billion flowing in, but you also have they need the statutory authority to be able to spend that. So as far as what that works out to, and this is right from their report, they on average approves, that allows them, that $800 million cap with an average grant of $50 million allows 16 projects per year. It fluctuates 16, 18, 19. The year we did Pine Grove for Rowley, there were 94 applicants. I think we were one of 19 that year. So at that rate, right out of their report, it will take 113 years for them to address the needs in all of the schools across the Commonwealth.
It's a known problem. It really is. I mean, like something that's often talked about, and there are several bills filed, correct, about evaluating the overall effectiveness of MSBA.
Yep. And I would argue for them as far as an organization, it's the funding. So this is this year's reality. So when we applied in '22, there were only 10 grants awarded. We all know the inflation costs and everything that's happened. They shut down the accelerated repair program in '23. So we're reapplying through the core program in '23. But only 10 were approved because the dollars didn't go far enough. So at that rate, it will take 189 years. If this 10-year projects per year becomes the new norm, it's going to take 189 years for the MSBA to reimburse, or to address the building needs across the Commonwealth. So as you just said, it is both a funding and it's that statutory cap. Again, that's not quick budget cycle, but that long-term, they need the authority to spend.
So I would say one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion about on Beacon Hill is the cost of inflation and the cost of increase for the construction projects that have already been awarded. And so that's having an undermining effect on being able to move forward. And we're talking about that. And there is some discussion about, do we do some special supplement to those to take pressure off the MSBA? Do we require them to fund, because they do have a mechanism to increase the funding on their own, to the extent they have it? So there's a lot of discussion about what's happened over the last few years with increased cost to projects that have been awarded and how we might address that.
So that it doesn't kick the can down the road, and they can at least stay at the average of where they were, not go backwards.
So just to adding to the comment, I did ask House Ways and Means in the meeting I did have directly about this issue, and quickly added that the costs for things approved were the issue, that they needed to make sure those were funded. But because all of the 6 towns in my district have crumbling schools. And it's a huge priority for me, highest educated state in the country, to make sure that our facilities match. So, but what the answer to me was, I don't know all the ins and outs of all the budget and the process, but continue to work with your towns, continue to encourage them, don't have them get disappointed about some of the disappointments of this last year because of the increases, that it was kind of a message of they are definitely looking at it. It's not something we want 189 years to replace our schools. So I felt like it was a positive message, hadn't quite figured it out, but at least the leadership was talking about this as being a big issue and ways in which to figure that out, especially with the increased costs. On the flip side, with the building trades unions, I've been asking the question every single time, how are prices, what's happening in prices, what's happening with supply chain. It seems like things are getting better, and I hope we continue that. So hopefully we won't see some of these pressures that we had during COVID. But just again, to reiterate, it's a conversation that I think we're all having, and it sounds like we're certainly not the only ones.
Excellent. Sure. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
So I apologize. I should have thanked you all for coming tonight in my first foray into this, but thank you for being here. And I guess my question is, when I was looking through the bills that were filed 2 months ago now, the MSBA ones all seem to be about studies, which we know that when you have to have a commission and then hold the hearings, we're generally looking at like a couple of years before we even have a proposal for action. And there didn't seem to be any bills that were really aimed at more immediate action. So I am encouraged by what I hear tonight, but I guess part of my question is there any way that we can sort of move that process along, so not do it necessarily through a commission, but maybe use the auditor's office or some other avenue? The MSBA has already done their self-study as part of the Student Opportunity Act. I guess, is there a way to move this process along a little bit faster? Thank you.
So, Nurse, I need to say for the record that whenever you're trying to undertake any kind of a reform about an education in Massachusetts, you are one of the best allies that anyone could ever have. You are tireless and a force to be reckoned with, so thank you for that. And second, it is good to see Phil here, because we have one of the most creative auditors in the history of the Commonwealth in office right now, and I know if there's a way to help that she will find that way to help. It would be difficult to envision a shortcut on this one, because of the magnitude of it. I'd love to be able to tell you that we could come up with something. I think the most that we can envision right now, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and make a prediction, would be some sort of itinerant relief to take pressure off the problem while we figure out a longer-term situation. There are various tools, and I don't want to speculate too much publicly about it, but there are various tools we could use to supplement that account. The challenge is that there are only 2 things in Massachusetts that get a piece of the sales tax. And so it's hard to say, okay, we're going to add more money to that, because nothing else gets that guaranteed revenue. So it's a tricky proposition. And I just would also point out that it wasn't all that long ago where we had to reform this program because it was taking school districts 10 years to start to see reimbursement. And short-term borrowing costs were getting out of control. And we were able to work that down a little bit and make it a little bit easier. Now it's starting to go the other way. But also there was a time when the certainty of this program was not what it is today, when it was very ambiguous as to who was going to get what. And there was a time when legislation mysteriously would move projects around on the priority list. All of that is behind us. So we have come a long way, but to take that next step, personally, I don't see it happening in any kind of a way without some sort of a commission arrangement other than with maybe a temporary fix.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate the honesty of that answer. I just think, I mean, buildings only last so long, and when you get to a situation where, I mean, we're patching the roof, I don't know how many times a year right now, you know, it's a situation where waiting 2 years seems like waiting for forever at this point. And for our high school students, it's half of their 4 years in high school, or if you want to look at the middle school, you know, it's a third of the total time that they're in this building before something could possibly even get rolling if we don't happen to slip into those 10 grants that are being awarded right now. So I think anything you can do would be much appreciated. And if it takes some creative solutions, I love it. So thank you for that.
So there's a lot of creativity on this side of the table. Let me just say that. And there's also a lot of creativity on that side of the table. So let's talk about how to do that. But I do think right now we need to work on the one thing that we know we have to focus on, which is making sure we're one of those 10. So, you know, I think we should focus on that while we talk about other options. But I wouldn't want us to miss the full court press saying just how urgent the need is that we need to address while we work on some other stuff.
Actually, we should just say too, right? If we become, hopefully that 10 is a little larger this year, but even if we get selected, we would still be staunch advocates for those coming behind us to make sure that those changes are going to come into play eventually. So long-term, busing. You nominated me, elected me, appointed, I don't remember what the right term is there, placed me.
Canonized.
Canonized. It was amazing. On a transportation commission, we reviewed this at the state level. The problem has we're at a crisis point, right? And we're not alone. Triton, we use North Reading Transportation, NRT. There are regions, it's now in the news. It happened to Boston, so now it's a big thing, right? Everyone's talking about this one company that bid the Boston Public Schools. We have limited drivers. There are no competitors. The same company, Go Beacon, now owns all of the companies in this area. So there would only be one company ever bidding on one of our bids. We have 2 more years, next year and the following year, before we have to go out to bid. No control of the costs. You know, students and families have been so patient. Kyle spends every morning getting up and listening from the bus company to find out how the buses need to be. Another bus driver isn't coming in. We have no subs, so we're rerouting. We're down 5 runs right now from normal because we've consolidated, and then we have no subs. So when a bus driver is out sick, we consolidate another bus. So we've got overpacked buses, people waiting, people getting forgotten. And again, it's not for good people working really hard, Kyle and the bus company trying. The system just doesn't work anymore. So I think there are. We don't have the answers. I know we talked about, are there creative solutions, creativity around the table that could make it more beneficial and easier for a driver to get licensed? Is there something as far as funding? Is there something where the state could provide resources specifically to transportation? We discussed on that commission about it becoming a state program, a state service. So at this point, the state has the ability to change regulations and restrictions and requirements that could promote competition, and we are at a severe disadvantage because there is absolutely no competition. So some way of incentivizing that competition and also incentivizing as an industry how we get drivers, and they're not district employees. We contract with NRT like most districts do. So we don't deal with the employment issues. We deal with the day-to-day issues of not having the drivers. And so our drivers that we have are wonderful. They're awesome. We just need more.
And reducing the requirements that it takes to be a driver. Like, why does a bus driver have to have a CDL license? And why do you have to go through under the hood? Because if a bus breaks down, the bus driver's not going to get out of the bus with kids on the bus. And they're not going to go out there and fix the bus if there is a problem. So I just think that requirement seems to be unwarranted. And doing away with a CDL license, I mean, they're not going to go drive tractor trailers. Well, they may if.
We don't want them
And one
to.
other thing is the amount of kids that are on a bus right now, you have one bus driver that has to take care of 70 kids on a bus right now, and it's just not safe, it's not feasible. In a classroom, you have 20, 25 kids, you have an IA in there to help the school teacher. You've got this poor bus driver that we've had to cut routes and everything in order to get our students to school. So we really need solutions to try and get drivers as well as have competition.
And if I may add, it's an educational issue as well. The school where I work, every single day, there's an announcement at 2 o'clock of which buses won't be there. And we'll have kids sitting there 45 minutes, maybe an hour after school. Programming after-school programs is almost impossible, whether it be extra help, extracurriculars, any of those things, because of the just unreliability of late buses. And the competition is getting worse. I drive by an ad every day for NRT advertising for drivers. Today, the MBTA added one. So it's seems to be spreading. I did have an interest, and I'm just putting this out there because we're looking for creative solutions. I had a conversation, I work in Lowell, with an immigrant group, the International Institute for New England, that resettles refugees. They were very interested in the existence of a driver shortage in terms of places they may be able to place people. I don't know what other agencies exist around the state that may be looking to place people for jobs, but if there's anything that can happen at the state level where that need could be met and fill another need, that might be an interesting. Yeah.
Excuse me, can you guys, when I was here the last time, you explained something to me that Kyle does each morning. You guys refer to it as bus bingo. I think our legislatures would be interested in hearing how Kyle's day starts. Thank you.
I can
Just
jump
the first
into.
few hours.
Yeah,
No
so
pressure,
just,
Kyle.
oh, thank you. So just by process, kind of like what Paul was alluding to as well, is because of the challenges where when we don't have any substitute bus drivers right now, if one calls out, then the process is to combine those students on that bus route with another bus. Sometimes there's enough capacity in another bus where it's a one-to-one. Sometimes you take that one route and split it out into 3 different routes. So what we've developed here is a process where at 6 a.m. we'll send a text message and email out to all families letting them know what the combinations are going to be for that day. Sometimes it'll go smoothly. Students will still have to be waiting. It's challenging because of how they weave those routes together on a moment's notice. Other times, it may be a bus driver picking up students who they're not familiar with that area of town. Unfortunately, last Friday, we had an incident where the driver missed 2 entire streets, and a group of high schoolers and middle schoolers who were supposed to be picked up at just after 7 a.m., the bus didn't get there until 8:30. So that was pretty challenging. So the impact on these students every morning, and we talk about the educational impact and how that's the start of their day, is pretty challenging.
I just want to make one other note. The promise that was made to regional schools was that the state would fund the busing. And I just think the state is letting us down now.
I do believe that regional transportation is covered at some point, right?
It's not covered 100%
Oh,
though.
don't get me started.
But there is,
Yes.
right, 97 million for regional school transportation to increase the reimbursement rate to 90%.
90%.
It's still not 100 though.
That's true.
So this is a particularly sore spot for me, and you may have seen some of my rants on the floor of the Senate. The statute says 100%. I've been in the legislature for more than 30 years. I've never seen it 100%. We are not meeting our commitment. But I think, as Representative Shan points out, we are trying to move in that direction. We've been able to move the needle a few points. Each last couple of years, we're at 85% right now. We definitely would like to get to 100%. I'm optimistic that in this year's budget for next year, we'll be able to move the needle again. But you're 100% correct. That was, don't get me started. But one of the inducements for communities to regionalize was that we would pick up the cost of transportation, because that was a cost that an individual district did not need to cover to the same extent.
Just a quick question, but it also sounds like and I know we've had this conversation before, but the monopoly of the bus company is also creating their own price structure. So therefore, 100% of, what is the true cost of bus transportation? What should be the true cost of bus transportation? And with one company really controlling everything with no competition, I guess twofold. Obviously, we want to try to fund 100% regional transportation, but at the other side of it, I'm curious of how much should it cost? Obviously, with shortages of workforce, that things fluctuate. But I guess I'm just kind of curious if there's been any comparison or studies of other regional districts. Obviously, it's totally different because of geographic area and how, but just if you had a sense of, without competition, is the cost getting artificially driven up that's not reflecting the school costs? We want to fund it 100%, but we also don't want to just give to someone who's saying, how about 100? How about 150? How about what? I mean, we want to know and fund what the need is.
Right.
So I just, not necessarily today, but would like to understand that a little more as you guys are navigating through that path.
Absolutely, and I think we know the costs have gone up exorbitantly, right? Exponentially each year. When we're, 2 more years, and we've thought about, these are option years, and there's still a significant increase in 24 and 25. But we know, there's districts that go out and over a 4-year, 3-year, 5-year contract, they're going up $500,000 per year or more. So don't want to use the C word, collusion, I don't know, right? But it's awfully weird when I started in that seat 18 years ago, Salter showed up, Laidlaw showed up, First Student showed up, other kind of small mom and pop shops showed up, and we had 5, 6, 7 people come and take bid packets, and 3 or 4 were responding and bidding. And that kept competition honest. When Go Beacon owns NRT, Salter, Coppola, everyone now in this area, flat out said, we're not going to have one company bid against another one of our companies. So it needs a lot of study, but I would agree that the state needs to have an invested interest, especially if there's going to be an argument that you're going to cover 100% of the cost outside that 1.5 miles, that you want to make sure you're reimbursing 100% of real costs, not necessarily inflated costs, so that it can't be a system where bus companies figure out how to get more money from the state.
And in fact, one of the counter arguments that I've received over the years for going to 100% is, if we do that, what incentive does the district have to control the cost?
Save money, yeah.
So there's got to be a way that we can combine those things.
Absolutely.
I know one thing that's driving up the cost of CDL, unfortunately, the federal laws would not let you take that away as a CDL driver because it's a share weight of the vehicle. A lot of the cost of trying to, and the reason why we're not seeing, because as I own a construction company with CDL drivers, one of the biggest causes used to be you could take a test at the registry, take your driver's test, that's $300, and now you're a CDL driver. Now, the state and federal government requires almost a $6,000 class. So it's driving people not to want to go do it.
Yeah.
And bus drivers, the rate you guys pay or the companies pay, it would take these people forever to pay this back. It's like, you know, someone with a $300,000 college education that's going to be a waiter. Yeah. You're never going to pay it back. Yeah. So that has a lot to do why we're seeing less CDL drivers across the board, is because the Department of Transportation doesn't understand the negative impacts that they're creating, and it's all because of some person got in an accident or something, and, oh, we need to qualify these people more. Well, you're not really qualifying them more. Mm-hmm. I think it worked a long time ago very well, how CDL drivers were created. And the other thing I would say as a parent, I know several times this year, like I think 4 or 5 times, my kids were half an hour to 45 minutes late to school. Mm-hmm. And then they're losing their education because we can't solve this bus problem. Yep. So me and my wife decided that we'll just, you know, work around our schedule and make sure we just take them to school. And we used to have a bus stop of about 13 to 14 kids, maybe 2 stand there now. Because the parents just do not have any confidence that the bus is going to show up. And I think that's a major problem in this district, and I've said it to you many times, Brian. Yeah. We're not the only parents facing this. Yep. My daughters, 2 of my daughters, I was panicking because I'm at the bus stop, no one's coming. Come to find out, some kid didn't get off the bus because the bus driver didn't even know where the kid was supposed to be dropped off at. That's a major problem. Yep. So I'm calling the school, hey, where's my kid? Where's my kid? Where's my kid? And everyone's calling the school on that bus because no one knows where the kid is. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's becoming, the transportation in the Triton District is becoming a major problem. And it's going to drive, unfortunately, eventually drive parents away from the school district, so.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is it's problem. So Salter is run out of a terminal on Scotland Road. They run Newburyport. I think they run Amesbury. Yeah, NRT, which is parent, you know, same company. We share the terminal on Hanover with Masco Tri-Town in Georgetown, in Triton, I think it's southern New Hampshire. But it's no different in other cities in town. Like every superintendent I talk to is dealing with the same things. We have, for high school sports, Georgetown, Masco, and Triton will share 2 buses for the entire spring athletic season. So every team, we have to have an alternating travel schedule, two charter vehicles and drivers to share between 3 high schools. So Kyle and our athletics director, Tim, were in his office the other day. I mean, just like, how do you even do that? I mean, the math does not work. So parents have been understandably frustrated, but also incredibly understanding, in that doing everything we possibly can. If this was a unique challenge to Triton, I would say, what are we doing wrong? But it's every customer of NRT, Salter, everyone's dealing with the same thing. There aren't drivers that are willing to drive. And it goes back to your original point of, if you have to fork over $6,000 to get the license to go make $21 an hour, the math doesn't add up. So
you're just a little funny note. So you're going to tell me that I'm going to be waiting a long time for my daughter to get back from softball after they go win a softball game?
It was already long, right?
Yeah, it was already really long.
Yeah. So smaller teams, right? We have the 2 smaller buses that coaches can take. Maybe get some more of those. But the track team, no, they fill 2 buses. So, you know, in the fall football, I mean, the bigger clubs, it's just, there's no work.
Well, this year we have 30 girls, so we have a very good varsity and JV softball team. So
we're not using the
we might even win the state title. So we'll see.
Nice. Let's do it. Without transportation.
I'd just add, you know, the cost of the CEL, the 70 kids on a bus, and the hours that you're working when you're driving a bus don't create really opportunity for taking another job too. So if you're relying for that as a source of income, that may be your best bet for your only source of income. So who is going to work 4 hours a day at $21 an hour with 70 kids on a bus in order to pay back a $6,000? That all of these things compound. So I had asked earlier, how can we incentivize these people to take some of the other jobs in our schools that are shorter term, like cafeteria workers, and we can't do it because they're not our employees, they're NRTs. But if there's a way to create an opportunity to keep those people working for the school for 8 or 9 hours consecutively instead of 2 hours here and 2 hours on the other side of it, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a workforce discussion, right? I don't believe that school transportation is the only piece of transportation that's suffering with the shortage of drivers. I think it's all transportation. So a significant challenge, definitely why it's on the long-term list. Yeah.
I just want to note as an informational thing, because I also hear the where's the skin in the game, is that we're only reimbursed for the students who live outside 1.5 miles from the school that they attend. So we're paying 100% for all those students who live inside the radius. That's always going to be our skin in the game.
That arrow just went into the quiver. Thank you.
Next time you're talking to Jay Sullivan at the Department of Ed, it's his favorite line. Yes, Mr. Walker.
Bruce, is it true that the budget for, schools in the governor's budget increased by about 8%? Did it go to anything new, or is it just to fill deficits and other things?
Oh, no. You may not like the answer to this, but the governor added, I was going to try to find it here, $6.58 billion to Chapter 70. The difficulty with this, and some of you may have heard me say this before, so I'm going to apologize for being redundant, is that with Chapter 70, you can pour a big bucket of money into the top of it, and by the time it filters down through the formula, what gets to this school district and many others is a very, very small fraction of that. So Brian alluded to it. Right now, Triton, as a district, only gets minimum per pupil aid. Right. So in the Student Opportunity Act, a lot of the changes that were made don't necessarily help suburban regional school districts. We were able to get transportation included in the circuit breaker. That was a big victory. But in terms of other structural changes, they did not happen, Jeff. So you wind up, you're always going to read about these big numbers that are in press releases and things about this huge amount of increased money we're putting into Chapter 70. But the way that that gets to you doesn't allow much to get through. And if you want to be here till the sun rises, I can vent about Chapter 70 even more than I did about regional school transportation. But there's a slide. Oh, Brian's going to get.
Just wait for it.
I'll stop there.
We should just go right to that slide. So I think we touched this as far as special education costs, right? Long term, the costs that we're incurring as a school institution, there are medical and residential costs that are being borne by a school system that aren't school-related costs. So the long-term ask here is to continue the fight. We've had this discussion forever about medical costs should be reimbursed through insurance, medical insurance, not through a town's school budget. So again, the one example here, $539,000 for one student, just moved into the district. We've never met this individual, just moved in this year. Once we hit April, there's the April 1st law. If they go past April 1st and don't move out of the district, we incur the cost next year. So that cost is 100% borne by Triton, and we have not ever met this student, and this individual is attending a school in upstate New York. But based on the laws and the way they work in Massachusetts, they moved in, so they're our cost. Again, not for a second going to disparage the needs behind that. We have some insight, profound. Would never want to have to deal with that as a parent, a father. So not debating the need or the merit of the placement, but absolutely the structure by which it's assessed to local school communities. So that's, again, we'll go right there, and then let's go to Chapter 70, so Bruce can talk about his slide. I have a special one that you can talk about.
I want to go back to your other.
Oh, I just had a quick question, because earlier you were talking of that kind of extraordinary cost, that there already was something that you had mentioned something that over 100 something that the state would cover.
So
for those extraordinary circumstances?
So this extraordinary relief, if it's funded in the budget, every year, if it's funded, any amount if our out-of-district costs hit 125% of the previous year. So if it increases by 25%, we're eligible for extraordinary relief, which is in essence a pothole fund.
Okay, it was a percent, not a.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then it's the dollars above that 25% to trigger the threshold. So that's the issue. If you're 24.5% more, that could still be $500,000, but you're not eligible for that funding.
But if you have like this one particular extraordinary cost per student, that's something that's borne by, that you would need to cover.
And hopefully, I mean.
Under that 120.
Correct. We're hopeful. We talked about that $911,000 increase. We're actually hopeful it does trigger extraordinary relief, right? It's kind of a weird thing to say. But hopefully those pan out, it triggers it, and we get some of that money back next year.
I was just trying to follow along. Thank you.
Certainly.
So before you move off this slide, Brian, I just want to thank you all because this ability to vent is wonderfully therapeutic. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
We're here for you.
But another subject that I just wanted to vent about it for a minute was the second bullet point that you have there. And I'm only going to talk about this for a minute, but I think it's important, right? So right now, we all talk about including students in the district. We talk about the virtue of that, and there are lots of reasons that is virtuous. So we encourage you to do that. You develop specialized programs, whether it be for kids on the autism spectrum or for kids for other kinds of needs. But when you do that, you get no support from the state. The only time you get support is when you do the opposite of that and you outplace a student. So for a number of years, it's been a huge issue for me, and I'm going to hope to enlist my colleagues in this crusade. But I think we need to consider how the state can support school districts that include students and develop the mechanisms to be able to address their needs in the local school district rather than having to outplace them. Now, that's not going to work for every student. You just mentioned a case where it clearly wouldn't work. But there's a whole big percentage of kids that never reach circuit breaker thresholds, that never get outplaced, that you're paying for, doing the right thing, and we don't give you any support. And again, I'm going to take another run at this in this year's budget. And I'm going to continue to because I think it is the wrong, it's a misalignment of what we say are our goals and the support that we give you to meet those goals. I'm done.
I appreciate that. And just as a reference point, we have it's called the TLC program. It's our autism spectrum disorder program. We have roughly 30 students, pre-K through 22. If those students were placed out, easy assumption of $100,000 with a tuition and transportation, that's $3 million for 30 students. That, right, these are the discussions where, and we get it, right? We have these discussions with the towns and like, we can't support this. This is too much money, but we're doing everything we can. And to your point, if there could be a mechanism that rewarded keeping those students where they are and where they should be. Again, as you said, there's always going to be the extreme where we can't meet the needs based on the programs. But if we can, there is a circuit breaker component. It's a pittance compared to when you hit that threshold when they're outplaced and transporting, you hit it automatically. So we would gladly welcome that and send no more students over to Ronnie at North Shore Consortium. That's her goal. All right. So let's talk about Chapter 70. We've talked about the Student Opportunity Act a bunch. There was a lot of discussion about the Student Opportunity Act. I just want to give you some data points on how that has played out here at Triton. So through that process, we had lots of discussions locally. We had a meeting up here with, at that point, it was Senator DeZoglio, Jason Lewis came, Senator Lewis came, had this big meeting in Salisbury. We kept talking about how people saw this as it's going to be the solution. It's going to give everyone the money they need and deserve for education across the Commonwealth. The SOA, Student Opportunity Act, it did tweak factors, some inputs in the formula. But to use the senator's analogy, you can put more and more money into the top. And this year it's approaching $600 million, almost double. I mean, a historic investment in Chapter 70. And I'll get to some facts of how that played out. But there were no substantive changes to the Chapter 70 formula in the Student Opportunity Act. There are many who would sit here and argue, oh, yes, there were major changes. There were changes, but not changes that impacted all students and all schools across the Commonwealth. So one of the, Senator Jason Lewis has filed Senate Docket 987 currently. It starts to change some of the substantive, and not to dive into this, but just to give that as one component of the substantive changes that can and need to change. Again, we're not going to go deep into Chapter 70, talking about boring. So the combined effort yield talks about the share of what the state's share should be and what the district share should be. Currently 59 for the district or town, 41 for the state. Senator Lewis's proposal shifts that over 5 years, shifting 5 percentage points from the towns back to the state. That would generate actual dollars for the Triton District, for the Pentuckets, for the Newburyports and the Georgetowns across the Commonwealth. So I don't want to go deep into that because that's just a Senate docket and there'll be lots of debate, but we certainly support those types of changes. But just this graph, some of you have seen it a lot, some of you have not. This is Triton's reality. So on this graph, we've got the red is our Chapter 78. The green is our local member assessments to our towns. The blue is our costs. The orange line is the percentage that the Chapter 70 represents as a percentage of our total operating costs. So in 2002, Chapter 70 represented 34% of our operating costs. Chapter 70 roughly covered a third of the operation of Triton Regional School District. In fiscal '24, with the $66,720 increase, it represents 18.3%. The percentage point, I won't go all the way back, the percentage point where I think Narissa had me repeat it, 3% increase, the increase in Chapter 70 represents 3% of the total increase to our member towns. That graph is going to get worse and worse and worse. And if the formula did not hold Triton harmless, we would receive $3 million less than we received this year. So again, I'll rant for a while, then you can, right? So you'll hear the term hold harmless. We're a hold harmless district because we get that minimum per pupil aid, which is why we need 500 per pupil. We'll start with 100. We'll start with 500. We'll get to 100. So the formula sees the towns of Newbury, Rowley, and Salisbury as incredibly rich communities. They're coastal communities, this property value. They made changes earlier in the formula prior to SOA to include both equalized valuation and income data. That helped, but it still doesn't solve the problem of truly dissecting the formula and looking at where it does and doesn't work for some cities and towns and districts. So the Student Opportunity Act was implemented, call it roughly fiscal '20. There's no improvement, right? That orange line has continued to go down. In fiscal fiscal 2, which was the first, that 34%, we were receiving $8.87 million. It went down in 2003, and then there was some weird backfill through federal dollars where it looks cattywampus, but it went down significantly and then has been steadily minimum aid increasing. This current year in fiscal '23 is the first time in 20 years since 2000, so '23 is the first time since 2003 that we've actually matched the amount of aid that we got in 2002. So fiscal '24 next year, so fiscal '23, we surpassed it. And again, we're going to go up by another $66,000, $67,000. So the reality is the Student Opportunity Act made promises. I think they were well-intended promises. I think there were probably some folks involved who knew what was going to happen. I think there were a lot of people who bought the assumptions hook, line, and sinker and didn't understand the realities. But here's 3 facts. When I actually give some props to Julie Kelly from Mass Association of Regional Schools, who did some dissecting of the data that was published on the DCC website for the increases. $586 million, right? Historic and almost double the investment. 71% of those dollars, almost 419 of the 586 million, are going to 32 districts. 319 districts across Commonwealth. 32 of them are taking 71% of those new dollars. 93% of it, 545 of the 586, are going to 106 districts. So a third of the districts in the state, in the Commonwealth, are sharing 93% of that massive headline press release, historic investment in Chapter 70. 212 of us, we are the 12 is us, 67% of the Commonwealth is sharing 7% of that Chapter 70. We're sharing $41.5 million between 212 districts. I would argue that that is not equitable. Here's how the 11 wealthiest towns in the Commonwealth ranked Weston down to Sudbury. That's their percentage increase in Chapter 70. We got a 0.74% increase. The average increase in the 11 wealthiest towns in the Commonwealth is 7.23. If we got a 7.23% increase, we'd get another $644,000 this year. We would welcome that as a starting point. But again, this is based on 2020. If we look at the Cape Ann League, these are our local communities, the esteemed North Shore Superintendent's Roundtable, as the senator referred to. The average increase is 4.7%. That would give us another $421,000. Newburyport and Linfield certainly skew those numbers. They have different factors that increased their aid, but you can see Amesbury, Georgetown, North Reading, Pentucket, Rockport, Triton, north or south of a 1% increase. And when you're talking about $9 million, that's not a lot of money. So long and short, like that 14% tuition hike in the solution that was originally proposed, it creates some winners and losers. Student Opportunity Act still does. And it is one of the largest investments in the Commonwealth that you as a legislature apportion. And it is not meeting the needs equitably across the Commonwealth. So that's my rant.
Is it a secret what Linfield and Newburyport has for a magic?
So,
and you don't have to answer it if it's
of why theirs went up?
Yeah.
So there's different, I actually was talking with Representative Shan yesterday, and they implemented tuition-free universal kindergarten. 110 students were added to their roster, have also housed refugees that added to their numbers. That, I would argue, without dissecting and really understanding it, that those refugee families probably generated more dollars. Their foundation enrollment in Newburyport only went up 34 students. So it's not, ours went up 21. So it's not just a straight, they got rid of tuition K. We did too. This is the first year. This is this year is finally, my gosh, can't believe we're saying it out loud, the first year that we have free universal kindergarten. So there are factors, but it's not just that. So when one would think, right, if the formula didn't have us, again, if we were not held harmless, we'd lose $4 million. If we were not being held harmless and we were receiving that $4.8 million, $4.95 million, we would have seen an increase when we added those 150 students onto our roster because our numbers would have been better aligned. But it's, I don't know if I would use the word secret, but it's not a clear, straightforward answer as to why, and I think it's still being dissected. And there's still, right, just the formula, and I say this as Pentucket, my peer, Dr. B, right, I think you've all been at meetings at his place too, right, they get $5 million more than Triton. And there's no reason for that whatsoever, other than they regionalized the year before Triton did in '94. We fully regionalized in 1995. Some folklore about we're part of the North Shore. They were considered Merrimack Valley. Their calculation was different. They received $5 million more than Triton. And if you want to match up the 3 towns of Pentucket and the 3 towns of Triton, They're not exact, but they're not $5 million different. So,
Brian, can you go back to that slide that showed the orange line? So this is so telling to me. We are 3 small towns. We have pretty much the same size budget, maybe a little more in Salisbury, maybe a little less in Newbury, but they're around $20 million a year budget for us 3 towns. We have an average school district that costs $50 million a year to run, just south of that. If this trend continues, we won't have municipalities, we won't have education, we won't have anything. This is unsustainable. It can't continue. I advocate like this constantly at the Massachusetts Municipal Association. I know you 3 want to help us. I know that with every inch of my bones, but you need help. And please, you need to help me help you, because I sit on a committee at the Fiscal Policy Committee, and I bring this up every single month. The new chair of the committee is the town administrator in Northborough, and he gets this, because I gave him the numbers that Brian gave us, and he said he got the same one. I threw those. What makes me really upset is that this is $500 million. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that we're going to get extra monies towards public education. And we're going to miss 212 districts in the Commonwealth are going to miss it. It's the Commonwealth stepping away from its obligation to fund public education fair and equitable. And it's wrong. And I need you guys to really think about how we can help you. I will talk to anybody who will listen to me. I think I've reached out to the Newbury Dems, and I've reached out to the Newbury Republicans, because I want them to bring it to the state level. And I want this to come up that way. It's going to come down from the different communities that belong to the Massachusetts Select Association. The cities, they get most of it. It's your Springfields, Lawrences, Hollyoaks, and they have a real need to. They have English as a second language. I understand all that, but they need to step up. Those communities need to step up and say, look, this is just plain wrong. It's just wrong. Or we won't have a Commonwealth that has education, that values education. That's it.
I agree. I mean, a lot of us are elected officials here, but I think it's time to stop allowing our elected officials to say one thing and do another, because these numbers are eye-opening. The wealth in some of these communities, people who are agreeing and doing this stuff, a bald-faced lying to the people of Massachusetts. And I know as an elected official, we got to be careful what we say, but I'm going to tell you a thing, looking at these numbers, they're bald-faced lying, and I'm hoping the new governor doesn't do it. And I'm sick of seeing the state reps and the senators doing it. It's bald-faced lying. It's not fair, it's not equity, it's nothing that has been talked to, that we sit at home and listen to the news. That's not what's going on right here. These numbers don't lie. It's not what's going on. When you have, and I know, Don, you represent Newburyport. Newburyport is the most wealthiest community in this whole area, and they get 20%. Triton is probably one of the least wealthiest communities, and we get 0.04. Look at Pawtucket, 0.04. I mean, you have West Newbury, but I can tell you Groveland and Merrimack are not wealthy communities. So it's time for legislators and elected officials to stop lying to the state of Massachusetts when they say they're going to go help people less fortunate than us. As my selectmen say, I say it all the time, we all judge by our ability to help people less fortunate than us. This is judged poorly. And it's time that, I know you guys stand with us, but it's time, if you need to get louder, trust me, I'm probably one of the loudest selectmen in all 3 communities. And anyone would tell you that. And I will go right to the State House and call them all liars to the face, because I'm not scared of none of them. If you're going to say it, you better do it. And it's time to step up. And whatever I have to do, I will sit with all the Newbury and Raleigh selectmen. And I'm telling you, I'm the patent tank in front of all of them. And I will tell, I will go to the people. It's time to step up. I mean, just look, Brookline, are you serious? Westford is the 175th most richest community in the country, and they get 17.68. Really? It's time to step up. That's all I have to say.
So there has to be a fix to this. I mean, yeah, you can speak.
I was just going to say, so we realize this is a long game, and I appreciate with Senator Tarr, one of the things that we had looked at for years on end was getting that bill on a commission to study regional and rural schools in either as part of the budget or as a separate bill, was not happening, and then it came through in the Student Opportunity Act. That commission has completed its work and published its report out of that, so we have that, and it has actionable items. So when we started playing this long game, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, really at this point, we've started playing that long game, and we've gotten to a point where we have some findings and we have some conclusions. And then on top of that, Mass Association of Regional Schools, I worked with Julie Kelly in the spring, and I know she approached Dr. Tafoya at the auditor's office, and that was part of you'll probably have the name of the report off the top of your head, which I do not. The one that came out in the spring that was about municipalities and the state and the relationship. I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head. I will look it up in just a second on my phone. But that also has a report and findings in it and recommendations in it as well. So we're at the point where we know what needs to be done. So while I appreciate the righteous indignation, and I believe it is needed at this point, part of it is that all the dominoes are ready to fall, right? This was set up and it's ready to go, and we know what needs to be done, and it's just a matter of how do we get that done? So I guess that's my question to you is, the dominoes are lined up, how do we get it done?
That was kind of my point, was what Narissa just said. I know you 3 can't fix this, but we gotta start walking down that road, and we gotta figure out some actionable items that we can do that can help us now on the short term.
I have to chime in from Raleigh. We are facing the biggest increase that we've seen in the school budget in many years. And we've topped out Salisbury this year, and we have almost $1 million increase, and that was reduced by the school board. It started out at a little over 1.2 million, I believe, and it's now just under 1 million. We can't afford $1 million increase on the school budget, and we had to vote Monday night at the selectmen's meeting that we're not going to support that increase. And the Finance Committee in Raleigh also voted on Tuesday night to not to support the increase to the Triton budget.
I'm just going to jump in, but I know the senator has more concrete, hopefully concrete, and ways in which we can continue to address this. And I'm 7 weeks into this position, and I've enjoyed all these discussions that I've had with youth, both in campaign as well as right now. And all of this type of information is critical, and I'm interested in both of those reports. But one of the things I feel not in education in a huge way, but also just the district up here, I mean, other than Newburyport being more of an urban city, we're not quite suburban. We're part of our communities are rural. We have $20 million to run a town for $20 million and then have $1 million increase is, I mean, it is. I've been in municipal government for 20 years, and just not necessarily on the school side, but understand that, I mean, you're trading something and you're asking people to really look at really, really hard things to talk about. And I don't necessarily right now have the solution, but what I do know is the more we talk to each other, and there's a lot of people that are making these decisions that have never been to this district, or really, it's easy to define kind of the more urban districts, and it kind of maps of need, but I feel like in the conversation that our districts here in the Second Essex were unique, and I feel like in a lot of these equations we're falling through the cracks, as the senator mentioned. You put money in, but we're still only getting tiny bits of it. And how we can figure that out is something I'd like to know more of. But we have aging populations. We all have open town meetings. It's really hard to locally figure this out. And I just I recognize that for all these small budgets, and how we can work together to kind of define who we are that's not meeting the criteria would be helpful for me to take with me to then continue this conversation with my peers and other legislators and senators to just help frame the issue. We know it's an issue, and this data helps with that. And who are we in this place, and why is it that you're at 0.74? So again, I hope to be working towards solutions, but appreciate this conversation and just help try to figure out why it is that we're only getting a couple drops from the bucket when there's a lot of money going in the top. So thank you for that. No, I'm good. I'm good. I was pushing it to you, maybe if you had more on the solution side.
with the magic bullet, right?
I was going to say, I noticed that you each had a mic, and Bruce doesn't have a mic. He just has to keep borrowing.
I think he would say he doesn't need one.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you for saying that before I did. So obviously I have a lot to say about this. I'm not going to bore all of you with it right now, but I want to suggest one thing. Brian, if we were to superimpose on that chart another orange line that showed enrollment, what would it look like?
Similar, right? Similar to the orange line. Right? It follows the orange line trajectory, straight line, not the other trajectory.
So here's part of our problem. We have in Massachusetts an enrollment-based formula, and we have seen in suburban districts tremendous declines in enrollment, right? So I just looked quickly, and between 2008 and 2023, the district has lost about 1,000 students. Now, you just had an uptick, which is good news. But when you have an enrollment-based formula and you lose 1,000 students, that's a big problem. So here's why we're headed for a train wreck in Massachusetts. We have an enrollment-based formula that doesn't take into account fixed costs that are increasing. So we started to get at that a little bit with the SOA, and the way that we did was when we asked all the superintendents, how is it that our base is declining but our costs are going up? What you told us, one of the things you told us, was that students were becoming more complex in their needs. And special education was a big part of that, and that's what drove our ability to change the circuit breaker. That was one answer. If we do not find another answer, Alicia, I'll give you another analogy. We are headed for a train wreck. Yes. Hold on. We've got declining enrollment and increasing fixed cost, and a formula that's based on enrollment. So we've got to try to get at that.
Yeah, and I'll add that we couldn't override our way out of this, even if we wanted to. I mean, we have Prop 2.5 there, too. And it's falling on the backs of our residents, and it's unsustainable.
I love your passion, the way you grab the microphone. I think there used to be somebody in the World Wrestling Federation that used to do that, and you remind me of that. So I don't have a silver bullet. I've been at this battle a very long time. I didn't like this formula the day the legislature approved it back in 1993. I took a lot of heat for voting against it. I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. So a couple of things. First of all, The foundation budget formula that was included in 1993 in the Education Act, I was on the Education Committee at the time, that formula was supposed to be reviewed periodically, and periodically was thought to mean every 3 to 5 years. It didn't happen until 2015. So for 12, well, no, longer than that. For all of those years, there was a growing disparity between the cost of education and what the formula said you should get. We should never let that happen again. So I amended the Student Opportunity Act to say that it can never go for more than 10 years. In 2015, a group of us, and Brad Hill deserves a lot of credit because he was in the legislature at the time, we fought to get the first Foundation Budget Review Commission that had in earnest ever happened since the law was initially passed in 1993. And the work of that Foundation Review Commission was the basis for the Student Opportunity Act. The problem is, my humble opinion, that the Foundation Budget Review Commission, and I helped to create it through my amendments to the budget, did half of its job. It looked at the cost of educating a student, and it said basically, does the foundation budget formula accurately reflect what it costs to educate a student in various communities of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? And I'm not going to get into the formula because I know everyone's eyes would glaze over, and we're on the first floor and jumping out the window wouldn't help. What it didn't look at was communities' ability to pay and equity among communities in meeting that obligation. My opinion is that we need to do this again. And we need to look at the second half of the equation, and we need to do it right. And I'm not saying to you something that I didn't say to the people that chaired the Foundation Budget Review Commission. So Narissa's right. We did create a new commission that looked at essentially rural schools where you had a huge declining enrollment problem. And it came up with some recommendations. And I agree we should pursue those. But I think the problem is deeper than that. You asked what you can do, and I'll get to it in a minute. Part of the problem is that when you look at the Chapter 70 formula, there are 200 legislators and 198 opinions about how to change the formula. So you have to try to figure out how to come to consensus around some things. Student Opportunity Act began to find that compromise, but here's the issue. Oftentimes when we look at this, it winds up being suburban communities versus urban communities. And we need to be able to get past that divide. And here's where you and everybody else can come in. Again, Narissa has been an all-star at this. We need to build a coalition that can help us get to 50% plus one.
That was my point. You guys need help. And Narissa, I know there's, and Brian, maybe you said it, there's some pending legislation right now that will act as a stopgap or a pothole to somehow help. Like, all I hear at the MMA level is that, aid to rural communities. We need more. They're going to try and throw aid to rural communities at this. But I don't know if that's right. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, right. So I think part of this does go back to exactly what Senator Tarr was saying, which is that the Student Opportunity Act was a battleground. What it ended up doing was really looking at the average district, and as he mentioned, the Chapter 70 formula is a per pupil formula. And when you look at the average cost of a district on a per pupil basis to run a classroom, if you have a classroom where you have 6 classrooms of that grade in a school, right, you can achieve great efficiency in that classroom, because as you add 5 students or lose 5 students, you've still got relatively equal classrooms. What we run into in our district is that as our numbers shrink or even as they grow, we tend to have very inefficient classrooms, because when you only have 2 or 3 classrooms of a grade in your school, you might have to drop down to 15 or 16 kids in a classroom before you can drop a classroom and condense, or vice versa, you're going up, right? So what happens is when you take that cost of a teacher and you say, look at that cost of a teacher over 20 students, that's your average. That's what's in the Student Opportunity Act. But when we're dividing by 16 students, the cost per student for that teacher is much higher. And we don't get credit for that. That is a good part of what's essentially happening in this formula. And I think it's if I remember correctly, it's the Commission's report. One of the recommendations that they look at is other states that have used like a multiplier on the number of students that you have, so that if you're not experiencing efficiency in your schools, they can essentially say, you know, it's an adjustment based on that inefficiency, because we can't get around that inefficiency. There is no way that we can compensate for that here. So it's, how does the state accurately represent that and award you your funding accordingly, if that makes sense. I would argue that putting something in the Chapter 70 formula makes it much harder to cut and would be the ideal long-term solution. I think there's some recognition that that's very difficult to do at this point, in part because you can't build that coalition easily. So they've looked at rural school funding and said, can we supply a lump sum to essentially augment that? And that's I think, where things sit today. I don't know if there's any appetite to change that at all. But just to go back to your coalition, the largest hold harmless district in the state is Boston. We have good company that we can go to.
And Boston is an urban community, which is really important, but that was a tremendous explanation of the issue that we face, and also why a lot of urbanized communities benefit from the Student Opportunity Act when we don't. So ultimately, everybody here is elected, appointed. You know that we got to get to 50% plus one. So we got to come up with some solutions that get us to 50% plus one. And a lot of us worked very hard on the Student Opportunity Act, knowing that we were also helping other communities that had serious issues. Now it's time that we make sure that the benefit expands to everyone. So there are some strategic decisions to make. Do we try to undertake some sort of a study, or can we do it without it? And how do we build that coalition? And a number of us have been working to build that coalition for years, and it's very, very elusive to get everybody to agree. We've worked through MMA. We worked through something known as the Suburban Coalition. We've worked through MSS. We've worked through MASC. We've contemplated lawsuits. There was a group that was founded around that idea. I went to New York City, to Columbia University, to meet with the lawyer and the law professor that had undertaken most of the successful lawsuits in the country, and didn't walk away with a lot of encouragement in terms of the ability to succeed. In fact, the way that we got the 1993 law was a case brought that caused us to in order to avoid further court action, that's why we did the Education Reform Act of 1993. That is not necessarily a successful way to go. But if you want to get to somewhere in the near term, before the 189 years pass so we can build a new Triton for the MSBA, then we've got to identify some common elements that we can get everyone to rally around.
Can you turn your microphone on?
I think there's 212 schools that are getting a small piece of $41 million. I think those towns would step up and say, no, help me.
They would say, help me, but the question is, would they all say, help me in the same way? And that's the challenge.
And do they
And
have shrinking populations in their schools?
most do. Statewide, we have a decline in enrollment. But you know what? I'm really glad Phil's here. Because here's one thing that prior auditors have done, and this auditor could do, is look at those communities and understand why they are getting what they're getting versus others. And Dr. Tafoya had done that. In fact, my recollection is, Narissa, he was actually here, and we had a meeting where a bunch of us were on the stage at Triton talking about this. But I mean, that kind of effort could be helpful at helping us target what those critical factors are that we need to try to address. So there's and I apologize for monopolizing the conversation, I really do. There's two things we need. We need to identify a set of things that folks can agree to. They might not solve everybody's problem, but they will move us in the right direction. And we have to build a coalition to get those things done. Senator Lewis takes an incremental step in his bill. If we were to get it today, it would be very helpful. Over the long term, I think we need more. But those are the two things that we have to do. We have to identify the substance that can build the coalition, and then we have to build the coalition. And that comes in an environment where we have the resources to do it, right? For years and years, the problem with changing Chapter 70 was that Chapter 70 has winners and losers. And if you're a winner, you don't want to lose anything. So what does that mean? You got to have additional money so that no one is a loser. That was the idea behind the hold harmless provision. We have resources right now. Hopefully they'll last a long time. As we sit here right now, we are about $1 billion ahead of our budgetary benchmark in tax revenue. After the supplemental budget gets signed, that number goes to about $600 million as opposed to $1 billion. The point is, we still have robust revenue that we can apply toward this problem. But it's a political game. Until we have things that people can all sign on to, and that may be a grand bargain. It may be we say some things to some people and some things to others, but we have a package. But until we get to 50% plus one, we're going to keep having this conversation.
Can I just add to you that the redistricting process actually took us backwards in getting that support as well. We used to have 5 legislators that sat on that side of the table, and now there are 3, and we're not the only community experiencing that. So while 211 districts looks like a lot, when you look at that number, it's not a huge number of legislators as a proportion. So that makes it difficult. We need to find people who fall outside of that category almost, that can see that point or fear getting back to that point, to also provide some support.
But I'd be quick to add, we have 3 wicked good legislators.
You are worth 5. How's that sound?
I like the way you think.
I would just like to add one more thing. We have declining enrollments, which a lot of districts do. And people ask, why do you need so many teachers? A few years ago, Brian had a graph that showed how our teachers have declined. But where our teachers have declined, we've actually had to add specialists, whether it's a reading specialist, a math specialist, social workers. So that also increases our budget as well. So I just don't want people to think that because we have declining enrollments that you can get rid of personnel.
So that was precisely what the North Shore Superintendent's Roundtable told us, is that the complexity of the student body and the needs are increasing even as the numbers are decreasing. In fact, it was a very humbling moment. This bunch created a fictitious district called the Tartown School District. And it illustrated that point, that even though the numbers are going down, the costs are going up. And to add to what Narissa was saying, a lot of it is about efficiency, right? It depends on where you lose the students. And you can't necessarily close a classroom if you only lose 3 students in that classroom. Mm-hmm. So this is, I'll just say it one more time. We're headed for a train wreck. Mm-hmm. We have a formula that's based on enrollment. We have enrollment that's going down for the most part, and we have fixed costs that are going up.
And you have a population that's more needy, especially during COVID and after COVID. Mental health has gone through the roof.
I'm glad you gave me a chance to make my historical perspective on the whole situation. I graduated from Salem State in 1965, 58 years ago. And I started teaching junior high math science for 15 years. And I averaged 25 students per class, 5 classes, 125 students. You don't have that class size today, and you can't have that class size today because you are dealing with more children with special needs that we didn't have. I had maybe 1 out of 125 that had special needs that needed help. You see a bigger population of kids that need more help, and we have to provide that in the schools. And that's why you have to have smaller class sizes, and that's why you have your enrollments of dropping.
Joe, I would agree with you, and I would also suggest that, number one, we have a more complex student body, in part because, well, no, I'm not going to say that. Part of the issue is that we've gotten far better at diagnosing the needs that students have. So some of those needs might have been there before, but we didn't recognize them. We do now. That's part of the problem. And we have to respond to those needs. And that's where you get the complexity of the student body that we have to address. The other thing that I would say has changed very rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years is the social emotional learning needs of students. We have a bullying situation that happens now because it doesn't just happen in school. Everybody's got a cell phone and a computer, and they get bullied around the clock if they're a victim of that. We've had issues of isolation that have occurred as a result of COVID-19, so there's no peer support for kids that have those needs. We've got tremendous mental health needs in this society. Schools are not exempt. So there are a bundle of things that are driving increased cost that, again, even as you lose numbers, those costs are going up for the numbers that you do have. Right. But as you can guess, I could talk a long time about this. It's very important. We all think it's very important. We're all committed to making a change. But if we're going to do that, we've got to remember the history that we've got here, and we've got to figure out a different path. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do that. I'll have some more news on some of that soon. But I think I come back to what are the things that we can advocate for? And I'll tell you, I would be happy to invite Chairman Lewis, the chairman of the Education Committee, to the North Shore to have a conversation with it. Brian mentioned that. We did it at Whittier when we were in the throes of developing the Student Opportunity Act. We kind of had a transition. Senator Chang Diaz was leaving the chairmanship of the Education Committee, and Senator Lewis was coming into it, so we brought them both. No problem inviting them to come and talk to all of us, and I'm sure my House colleagues would invite the House chair for that conversation. That might be a good start. It worked in the past. We'll do whatever it takes, but we have to find a way that we're not just spinning our wheels. We have to find a path that responds to the urgency of that situation. And there are a couple of different ways to do it, but we got to figure it out. And we cannot do it alone. We need your help. And you know, whether building a coalition is through one of the organizations that I mentioned, whether it's parent to parent, yeah, I mean, Alicia, let's have them all at the starboard galley for hors d'oeuvres. I mean, but we got to, that's the only choice. There is no other choice. This is not going to happen with 3 legislators, no matter how passionate or committed we are.
Right. I think one of the things before we start pulling people together is we need to determine, and I don't know if we want to do this alone, or what's the ask? What are we going to ask for?
Well,
I don't know that answer.
We have a vehicle to start to define that in the superintendent's roundtable. And I know I've talked about it a lot. I can't tell you how effective I think that group is at helping us to define our course. It worked with the Student Opportunity Act. But we got to spend some time figuring out those things. What are the most effective things we could do? So a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Bartholomew, Brian's colleague, had a very similar conversation with all of us about Pentucket. And as part of his slide deck, he said, well, here are some of the most impactful things, changes that you could make. And I think that's the kind of conversation we have to have. But we have to start here and figure out who we can ally with that can agree to those same kind of solutions. This is an enormous, enormous challenge. But you might argue that we have the ability to solve it now in a way that we haven't had in a long time.
And correct, I agree, Bruce. And the other thing why I want to, I think it's important now, is Senator Lewis put that Triton effect slide in his deck when they passed the Student Opportunity Act. So they're aware. It's not like nobody knows this is happening. It's like, oh my God, where the, penny, and the sky is falling. People understand this. It's just that we've got to try to find a way, well, to define what it is that we're asking for, what the ask is, and then how do we build a coalition around it?
I also think that a lot of times we have the argument of the population-based formula. And I don't think it should be forgotten that we still sit in an area that can have different impacts. For instance, we might have some mandated types of housing come into Newbury, which would increase our student base. So Triton needs to stay prepared. I mean, you guys got all of the planes that all of a sudden, if the pilots didn't stay in place, you could have mammoth increases.
Well, we have the same MBTA requirement.
Yeah, and you have too, I forgot. And, you do. So it's like you can't suddenly shrink our school systems because you don't think that we're always going to be on a negative population basis, because that doesn't exist in these days and times either.
I was finding more PowerPoints from that, those years of presentations of just the changes. It was in 18 where we presented those, the change of our, and again, towns were asking, how do you have a population drop of, at that point it was comparing 02 to 17, of 572 students and still have the same number of staff. But it's that, so when I was at Newbury Elementary as the assistant principal and principal, 01 to 05, 650 students at the school. There's 400 there today. We had 4 and 5 sections when I taught at Pine Grove, 4 and 5 sections per grade level. But it was a classroom teacher, 20 to 25 students, a special educator per grade level, maybe an IA here and there. Right now we almost have 2 to 1 IA supports for teachers. We have clinical social workers that were certainly not a thing in schools a decade ago, and we have 6 or 7 on staff now. So we've traded the employee populations or cohorts or types. And I know that's hard for people to understand, right? You have less students, it should cost less. So you've got the fixed costs, which is just the reality of still heating, cooling, operating facilities. But it's the nature of the needs. And as you said, we have to respond to the needs. We can't pretend like we'll go to just 2002, not 1965, right? We just can't pretend it's the same. It's just flat out not the same, so.
And we can't, this is something the towns can't do. We can't fix this. We just can't. We need the state.
And as I've said before, that if I know there's an increase in social workers, increase in all of these items to help with social emotional. If you don't help with that, then you increase the amount of kids who are on IEPs, and those are federally regulated contracts that you have no choice. And if you're not meeting the needs of students on IEPs, then you're sending them to these 14% schools that have just increased everything. So if we're not meeting the needs in our schools, we're sending them out to really expensive schools to pay more. It's just, there is no negotiating when a child is on an IEP and they've gone to mediation and they have said, nope, you don't have a choice, now you're going to a $500,000 school.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was actually the question I was going to ask. Obviously, with the fixed costs, I just had a question. So with these slides, I'd like to know kind of those fixed costs, how those have grown over time. And I know we met before, talked about there's, each town has to pay at least a certain amount, but last time we met, they were, I mean, I don't remember how many times more each community was paying into the system. And then, yeah, and my curiosity is IEP or special needs that, and then to the senator's point about circuit breaker and how we're actually encouraging reimbursement if you're placing students out. So of the enrollment, and I'm not sure if, does Chapter 70, if students are outplaced, are they're outplaced, so they're not calculated in what you're getting?
No, they're also in your enrollment numbers, yeah.
They're in your enrollment numbers, so.
Their enrollment figure, the cost is not associated or included. It's an assumption in the
Okay.
formula. It doesn't calculate any actual special education
Okay,
costs.
well, I was just kind of, because you have this wonderful data, and it sounds like you've had data in the past of some of this information of just kind of those trends of fixed costs, students being placed out, the minimum costs, but actually how much more these towns are paying, and then the additional requirements like IEP that are in those numbers of students that, things that you don't have a choice if you do or don't do, you have to do, or just information points that I'd be interested in knowing more about after this meeting.
Yeah, we can certainly connect and get you, we have data. And you,
Go ahead.
I would say the inefficiencies Narissa talked about with a classroom apply to the special education and the specialists as well. If you have a program where the teacher can effectively service 5 or 6 kids, but you actually have 7, now you need a second special educator, and it's even a more extreme case of the classroom, that shift from, okay, at 40 we can have 2 teachers, but at what point do we have to go back to 3? Instead of talking about 40 or 50 kids, you might be talking about 5 or 6, or in the case of a specialist, okay, can effectively service 30 students who are reading below grade level, but we have 37. And as your population changes there, it's just the percentage, it plays across all of these new positions as well. It's not just a classroom issue.
I want to thank the 3 of you. Senator Tar, you come here every year, and we really appreciate all that you do. And now that we have 2 new House reps, I'm sure that you're going to work just as hard as he does. It takes a village. It takes all of us to do the work that we have to do for our students and our communities. And I appreciate everybody that's come here to the table tonight.
I would just say that when I began coming to these meetings, I had no gray hair. But I want to assure you that the North Shore Legislative Delegation has always had a good working partnership, and I have no reason to believe that won't continue with my 2 new colleagues. And we're all committed to this issue. We all want to make a change. We all want to make progress. And it's going to be a huge effort, but I'm pleased to have 2 representatives that are also energized on this, and we've just got a long way to go.
And our 3 communities will do whatever it's needed to help push the envelope. Thank you very much. Have a nice night.